love it. I love it. And I also love our Decode segment. So let's get right to it, Nando. Tell me about what's going on with Facebook and, other tech companies that are being targeted by prosecutors.
Well, Anna and the dear viewers at home, are you terrified of a future that is essentially a techno-feudal dystopia? Well, this Decode segment is for you. Overall, the pandemic has heightened trends that were existing before, and one of them was the growing power of big tech. I mean, just look at this chart. The tech stocks are surging. Apple became the first company ever valued at $2 trillion. Amazon, Microsoft, Alphabet, which is Google, and Facebook are not far behind. But something really big happened in the last week, and it hasn't gotten as much attention as I think it probably should.
This morning, federal and state authorities want to break up Facebook. The world's largest social media company hit with two major lawsuits, one by the Federal Trade Commission, the other by attorneys general in 46 states. Both lawsuits allege Facebook illegally crushed its competition, violating antitrust laws and creating a monopoly.
That's right. 46 state attorneys general, I've always wanted to say that, are alleging that Facebook is an illegal monopoly. And then just days later, 38 state attorneys general filed a similar lawsuit against the other dominant player in online advertising, Google.
The Department of Justice is suing Google today in what is the largest antitrust case against a tech company in more than 20 years. Our tech reporter Brian Fung has been following this. He's on the story this morning. I mean, this is the biggest really since Microsoft, right? What is the DOJ alleging here?
Yeah, it's the biggest antitrust case against a tech company in at least a generation here. What the DOJ is alleging is that Google controls 80% of the search market in the United States, and it's using its power to hurt rivals and damage competition.
The Trump administration and a coalition of red and blue states working together to take on Google and Facebook head on. I mean, this really kind of came out of nowhere. And it's hard to overstate just how big of a deal this is. I mean, the last time the government stepped in to break up a company was Microsoft back in the late 90s, early 2000s. And since then, there's been a ton of corporate consolidation in almost every sector, from banking to entertainment to beer. John Oliver did a whole segment about it, and I'm just going to use that clip because his team already did all the research for it.
Look, and airlines here are just the beginning. The rental car business is now 90% dominated by just 3 companies. The US beer industry is 70% controlled by just 2 companies. And online search engines are, of course, as we all know, dominated by one major player. That's right, say it with me, Bing. That's right, Bing, the best way to Google something. In fact, look, full disclosure here, even our own parent company, Time Warner, is currently trying to merge with AT&T, which makes this story a little dangerous for us to do. Although, that is presuming that AT&T executives managed to get their shitty service working long enough to see it. AT&T, it's the top telecom company around, alphabetically, and nothing else.
Thank you for that, John. And the Federal Trade Commission, which regulates mergers and acquisitions, have basically sat back and allowed all of this consolidation to happen without any pushback at all, until now. Now, we won't know what the outcome of these lawsuits will be for probably years, but it is a step in the right direction because the only entities that are large enough and powerful enough to confront these tech behemoths are national governments. I mean, we've seen how Amazon can just run roughshod over Seattle's local government when they tried to pass a very modest tax to fund more homeless shelters. And even a state as big as California was powerless to legislate Uber's employment model, culminating in the passage of Prop 22. And while the European Union has been pushing back on big tech for a few years now, the American government had basically done nothing up until now. And I want to focus on the case of Facebook first because I think it will be easy to understand for me and most people, given that it's products that most of us use all the time, every day. The key to understanding the government's case is Facebook's acquisition of Instagram and WhatsApp. Here's New York's State Attorney General, Letitia James, who is leading the onslaught.
The two most glaring examples of this unlawful scheme were Instagram and WhatsApp. Facebook bought Instagram for $1 billion in 2012, when the company did not even have a cent in revenue. And in 2014, Facebook paid the extravagant amount of $19 billion for WhatsApp, which was far more than industry experts and even Facebook itself valued the company.
Yeah, and back in 2010, when we were all blissfully surfing the web on our computers rather than our phones, a small little company called Instagram was founded in Silicon Valley. And as smartphone technology improved and we spent more and more time on the internet on our phones, Instagram's filters and cooler design and general newness meant it was catching fire, while Facebook's stodgy old desktop design made it feel like a thing of the past. The kids, as they say, were gramming. So Zuck just bought it. And as Letitia points out, that sent a powerful message.
They also sent a clear message to the industry. Don't step on Facebook's turf. Or, as one industry executive put it, you will face the wrath of Mark.
Wait, Kale, I want to play that clip again for the people, because I just wanted people to notice that it's just so savage that CNBC ran that press conference while side by side having a live graph of Facebook's stock price just collapsing by the second. Look, check it out.
They also sent a clear message to the industry. Don't step on Facebook's turf. Or, as one industry executive put it, you will face the wrath of Mark.
Oh, baby, the good old stonks. So yeah, back in 2012, Facebook bought its most threatening rival, and all was well for Mark. For a time. Because the kids, they're fickle. The fads, they're changing all the time. And in 2013, there was a new player on the scene that all the teens were just raving about.
Turn now to the latest app that has caught fire with teens. It's called Snapchat. You know, the appeal is, it says you can share a snapshot with friends without any risk of an embarrassing viral moment because the photo's programmed to vanish seconds after it's set. But is it encouraging kids to send inappropriate photos that actually won't disappear? ABC's Lindsay Davis has more on the controversy.
This message will self-destruct in 30 seconds.
It's technology right out of an Inspector Gadget episode. Teens everywhere believe they're sending their own self-destructing messages online with an app called Snapchat.
Yeah, in the immortal words of Yo Gotti, Snapchat me that. The Family Show. Can't go there. So the kids were leaving Facebook for Instagram, and then they were leaving Instagram and Facebook for Snapchat, so Zuck tried to do the thing that he had done just a year earlier, buy his competitor. Except Snapchat turned down his $3 billion offer, thinking, hey, we got the momentum. We can crush the Zuck. But they underestimated the wrath of Mark and his dominant position in the marketplace, because he owned Facebook and Instagram. He had way more users than Snapchat, and in a way, that's part of the appeal of a social media platform. The more people that are on it, the more social pressure there is to join it. And Snapchat had this cool new thing where you could send your nude and it would immediately disappear. So if Zuck couldn't buy them, he just copied the technology in order to crush them when they launched Instagram Stories. And apparently, Facebook executives were pretty open about this.
You broke this story overnight, and you quoted Kevin Systrom as saying other companies deserve all the credit on this. That's not something you hear Facebook executives say very often.
I think it was kind of hard for Instagram and Kevin to really deny that Snapchat pioneered the format here. You know.
So Facebook either buys its rivals or uses its market size to crush its rivals. And to me, it seems a pretty open and shut antitrust case. Facebook is a monopoly. And for its part, sorry, I just knocked my computer. For its part, Google is also an open and shut monopoly. I mean, seriously, does anyone use any other search engine? And the question is, why should I care? I mean, boo-hoo, some tech assholes are getting screwed by Zuckerberg. This is totally unrelated to me. Well, for one thing, the internet has become a sort of virtual reality for mankind, and having a handful of private tech companies control that space is just bad in a lot of ways. But concretely, for starters, Facebook and Google's dominance in the online ad market has essentially killed journalism. I mean, before, it used to be that websites and publishers could control their own ad sales, and it was never a great model, but it did lead to a bunch of sustainable news organizations. Remember when there used to be a bunch of websites that you could just read and all had their own little delightful tone and focus? Well, they're all gone because Facebook and Google have essentially hoovered up all of the advertising money in recent years. As more and more of our online time migrated away from computers and onto our phones, our time spent has basically been within apps on our phone rather than through a browser. This means that the control of the advertising went to the app, i.e. Facebook, instead of the publisher, i.e. your favorite website or newspaper. And that means that Facebook and Google just swallowed up all of those ad dollars. And this has basically killed local reporting and investigative journalism, even in pretty big cities. For example, Pittsburgh, with a metro population of about 2.3 million people, does not have a daily newspaper. And while I think that the effect of social media-driven fake news is somewhat overblown in the US, I still think that the problems with the way America gets its news predate social media, and indeed, the biggest cancer in the American news ecosystem is, in my opinion, still television news, both local news stations that are essentially PR operations for police departments, and cable news, which just turns our brains into mush. And of course, who could forget the most consequential bit of fake news in my lifetime, that time that the New York Times said Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. But it is hard to ignore certain realities. There's a Twitter account, for example, that automatically posts Facebook's top 10 most shared posts of the day, and every single day it looks a lot like this. And this problem has had real effects, for example, outside of our borders. For example, fake news delivered through WhatsApp, which is owned by Facebook, was key in the rise of Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil. Here's Glenn Greenwald tweeting, "Pretty fascinating scandal involving Brazil's election. Bolsonaro has benefited from a tsunami of fake news spread en masse on WhatsApp, making mass media irrelevant. It was revealed today that corporations have paid millions for this, which is illegal in several ways. While the West obsesses on the spread of disinformation via Facebook and Twitter posts, Brazil is showing that WhatsApp, which is huge in Brazil but lots of other places, can be more powerful, as it seems to be personal messages from friends and is distributed by the millions." But beyond the threat to journalism that these platforms pose, there is something even more fundamental, and that is that they are turning our every social interaction, our friendships, our relationships, our families, into opportunities for profit. And the effects of this are predictably very, very bad. In The Guardian, last week's Weekend's guest, Richard Seymour, writes, quote, "Social media addiction is rarely understood in this extreme light. Nonetheless, users often describe it wrecking their careers and relationships. The complaints are almost always the same. Users end up constantly distracted, unproductive, anxious, needy, and depressed, yet are also curiously susceptible to advertising. Patrick Garrett wrote of his social media addiction causing a desperate, hollow pressure of waste in his working life as a journalist. Social media addiction has been linked repeatedly to increased depression. Interaction with the platforms correlates with a major decline in mental health, while increased screen time, or time on device, may be contributing to a recent surge in teen suicides. Facebook's own guileful way of presenting the issue was to claim that while passive consumption of social media content could pose mental health risks, more engagement could improve well-being. This claim, while not supported by the research, would mean more profitable data for the site. Isn't that funny? And we can all recognize this behavior, even if we are not ourselves in a full-blown mental health crisis. We can see echoes of that in our own lives. We may know people who have been lost to Facebook insanity or relationships that were destroyed by it. So now, the first few years of the Biden administration will be shaped by this landmark antitrust case. It will be interesting to see just how the politics of this will play out. On the one hand, there is a growing political consensus, not just amongst the population, but amongst politicians themselves, that we need to do something about the power of tech. But on the other hand, the Biden administration is quietly stuffing his transition team with a bunch of Facebook and Google people. So we'll see how that plays out. But while I applaud this move by the brave attorneys general, it is true that, not to sound too much like Hillary Clinton, breaking up the Facebook into its constituent parts won't end racism. No, I'm kidding. But breaking up Facebook into its parts is just a first step. And zooming out a bit, it is true that things like social media, and especially search engines, are probably natural monopolies, meaning that they don't necessarily work better when there are a bunch of smaller firms competing. Think of something like a subway system. It used to be that the subways in New York were run by private companies, competing with each other rather than coordinating with each other. And as you can expect, that was absolute chaos. A subway system needs to be that, a system, so that you can coordinate schedules, which routes need more or fewer trains, etc. There needs to be a single entity controlling all of that, which is why it's something that needs to be publicly administered for the benefit of all, rather than given to a private capitalist so that he can enrich himself. Social media and search are, in a way, similar. The search engine simply works better when there is one giant one receiving more inputs so it can better inform the results it gives to you. Ditto with social media. One of the points of social media is that everyone is on it. So if we're going to have things like search or social media, our goal should not be simply to limit their power, although that is a critical first step. Beyond antitrust, we should build towards a future in which these services are democratized. Last week on this show, Richard Seymour suggested that in the UK, the BBC could launch its own publicly owned social media. In the context of the US, the best example we have is probably the US Postal Service. I mean, the mail is a natural monopoly, and the Postal Service connects all of us in this country, is publicly owned, provides good unionized jobs to its workers, and critically protects our privacy in a very meaningful way. When we send a letter, we are quite confident that the Post is not going to try to get information out of it for profit. And Yanis Varoufakis, the former Greek finance minister, has put together proposals for how we can democratize these firms. He writes, even Google's fiercest critics use its technology to research their fiery tirades against it, or more mundanely, to find their way around a foreign city. Let's be honest, life without Google would be awfully more tedious in a variety of important ways. But that is not a good reason to leave Google and the other tech giants alone. On the contrary, the nature and importance of their contribution make it imperative that they be placed under democratic control, and not just because of the well-appreciated need to protect individual privacy. And this is true. I mean, we don't want to go back to a world pre-search engine. Even if that were possible, the cat is just out of the bag. And then he gets into what needs to be done. Google cannot credibly argue that the capital generating its profit stream was produced entirely privately. Every time you use Google's search engine to look up a phrase, concept, or product, or visit a place via Google Maps, you enrich Google's capital. And while the servers and software design, for example, have been produced capitalistically, a large part of Google's capital is produced by almost everyone. Every user, in principle, has a legitimate claim to be a de facto shareholder. Of course, while a substantial part of big tech's capital is produced by the public, there is no sensible way to compute personal contributions, which make it impossible to calculate what an individual share might be. But this impossibility can be turned into a virtue by creating a public trust fund to which companies like Google transfer a percentage, say 10%, of their shares. Suddenly, every child has a trust fund, with the accumulating dividends providing a universal basic income that grows in proportion to automation and in a manner that limits inequality and stabilizes the macroeconomy. We on the left have to be thinking about this kind of stuff. We cannot retreat from these debates, because if we leave it to the libs, we're just going to get Microsoft 2.0. And we have to place this fight against big tech in the context of the broader fight against capital. Antitrust is just a part of it, but things like the Amazon unionization fight, which we talked about earlier in Bessemer, Alabama, which is still ongoing, is the other critical part.
Yeah, I love that. That was probably the best in-depth coverage of that story. And to be honest with you, I didn't know what to really make of it. And not that, I didn't know how I felt about the Justice Department prosecuting Google and Facebook, but I was just curious, where the left really stood on this. And you made a really great point about how the end goal should be to nationalize these tech companies and, not have it be a private company that still has a profit motive. And when these are, platforms that are being used by people like us, for instance, in order to spread a certain message, well, that gives too much power to a private company to decide what the narrative gets to be, what type of content gets, floated to the top, what kind of content gets buried. And there's a very real reason why you see right-wingers constantly trending on most of these websites. It's because they know how the algorithm works. Their pro-corporate message, their pro-tax cut message aligns perfectly with these, various platforms. And so if you're doing content that's highly critical of, let's say, Facebook and its practices in selling data, is that content going to do well on Facebook? Probably not. I'm not stupid enough to think that they don't, game the algorithm to their advantage when it comes to certain content. And that's a problem. And I love that you mentioned what this has done to local news, but also to national news, people who got their start putting out digital content, right? People who are part of this new media revolution. Every year, the rules change. And I feel like every year you find yourself trying to figure out what this opaque algorithm is. And even when you do you really want to cater to a private company's algorithm when you're covering news, which comes along with, I believe, an incredibly giant responsibility to inform people about what's really going on in the country, in the world. So it's been really difficult to survive on these platforms. It's been incredibly difficult to be able to cover the stories that you want to cover and you will cover, but you're going to take a hit because the algorithm's going to work against you. And then one final point I just wanted to make about just like the divisiveness of the content that you see go viral on these platforms. There's a reason for that. Mark Zuckerberg, it reminds me a lot of what Nixon did when it came to this study that he had commissioned on the war on drugs, right? He commissions this study, and it's called the Schaefer Report. The Schaefer Report finds that marijuana legalization is not going to be a public health concern. It's not going to cause, any of the damage that conservative lawmakers felt that it would at the time. And so Nixon takes it and is like, no, ripping it up, throwing it away, right? And Zuckerberg did the same thing when he commissioned a study within his own company to see what kind of impact some of the content on the platform was having. And the study found that, actually, look, it increases engagement. However, this divisive content, which increases engagement, is actually leading to a lot of division, a lot of, political issues, all of that. And he just ripped it up, don't care, just going to move forward because we want the engagement. And more engagement means we can harvest more private data, which they then turn around and sell to third parties. I mean, we've talked about this on the show so many times. So I think this is a good first step. I think your analysis on this is right. And I think the ultimate goal should be to nationalize these companies rather than have a private, have like a CEO like Mark Zuckerberg decide, what can and can't be held on these various platforms or on his platform. And then finally, Face the Wrath of Mark, that video.
So good.
I love it.
She's the best.
I love it so much because she is the best. But you know what I think about? I immediately think about like his face and his haircut. Yeah. And I'm just like, man.
We can't be led by that guy.
It's amazing how much power that guy has. I know. It's amazing.
That guy can't be like our dictator. Like seriously, he's too ugly. I'm sorry. That's just we can't allow that. I mean, what's maddening about a lot of these debates is that because they sort of get filtered through the partisan lens in which everything gets filtered in the United States. It's especially when it comes to tech platforms, regulation of what gets published on it or not. On the one hand, it is true that we don't want to give Mark Zuckerberg the power to just decide what is fake news and what is real news. I mean, you can see how that's a problem. I mean, just this week, there was a case of Instagram suppressing any content that criticized Biden for his support of the crime bill. Like, it was really insane, this is like a pretty conventional wisdom at this point that Biden was like a big part of the 1994 crime bill. But because like some fact checker in something like claimed that it didn't exactly cause mass incarceration or whatever, like some sort of little small insane fact checking detail, which is a debate you and I have had in the past about the role of fact checkers, that they basically were taking down like people who were sharing that on Instagram. And it's like that we shouldn't, that's crazy. We can't allow that. On the other hand, you also like, you look at just those Facebook top 10s every day and it's like, Dan Bongino, Ben Shapiro, Daily Wire, like every single day. And if you're some kid and you start like going down a YouTube rabbit hole about like the Federal Reserve or something, like you might start off in the right place, but then like just the recommendation algorithm will just start taking you down a deeper and deeper insane rabbit hole. And like something needs to be done about that as well. So, because it's like filtered in like the sort of liberal conservative partisanship, the debate is maddening because the only real role is democratization. The only real thing to do is democratization, that we should have a say in how these things are regulated, not letting. So that's like one aspect of it. I mean, and the other aspect is to recognize that things like Amazon and Google like provide a really good and necessary service at this point in our lives. Like Amazon does provide an excellent service for consumers. Like, it makes it very easy to get things, so the question is then what do we do about it? Like, how do we democratize that for all? And that's the real debate we have to have. Like, we can't, like, we're not going to go back to a world of how it used to be. The goal is to harness technological progress for all, to make it so that we all benefit from it rather than we're all just kind of slaves to it. That's the real kind of debate that should be happening. So things like this scheme that Varoufakis comes up with of creating these kind of public ownership trust funds that kind of oversee these tech companies is an interesting way to look at it. It's one example. I mean, I'm sure there's many other schemes to do it, but the fundamental principle remains that it should just be owned by us for the benefit of us. I think that's how we have to reframe this debate. But again, this antitrust thing, it's remarkable. I mean, it's just, I did not expect this to happen. I mean, there's been kind of a lot of, there's been a lot of organizing around it, especially around like this kind of anti-monopoly movement that's happened, which I have some disagreements with, kind of ideologically. But I think that on some level, we both kind of agree that there's just too much power in these people right now. I mean, like, just look at the stock, just look at their market cap. I mean, it's insane. I mean, it's like they dwarf the banks, they dwarf, oil and gas companies. It's just their size. It's their sheer power of them is just overwhelming, and we need to do something to at first just stop that growth, and then we can maybe sort of catch our breath and decide what we do after it. But so yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it plays out, because I mean the Trump administration kind of did a funny thing, right? I mean, they just did it on the way out and kind of left it to Biden, which is fair enough, I mean, because now that it's ongoing, like it's going to be a really bad look if Biden is going to be like, oh, actually, we're just going to remove all these things, I mean, he could just blame it all on Trump, and the libs will probably go along with it. But I think that there is enough of a awareness from everyone that social media there's a problem with it. Like, maybe we can't articulate it, maybe we don't know how to solve it, but we all agree that we don't like this current state of affairs. We don't like it. So yeah, it'll be interesting.
Yeah, I'm curious to see how it plays out. But, the way that things are set up, it also gives you this illusion of choice as well, right? Because, you might see a negative story about Facebook and how they're intentionally using divisive content in order to increase engagement, in order to harvest more of your data to sell to third parties without you even really realizing it. But what are you going to do, right? Okay, well, I want to keep in touch with my friends. I'm going to go to Instagram. So I think that this, again, I think your analysis is spot on. I think you're right about what the end goal should be. But it's really difficult also to regulate these tech companies when they're honestly a bunch of different businesses in one. Right? Is Facebook an advertising firm? Yeah. Is Facebook, is it considered a news site? You know what I'm saying? It's like so many different things in one. And the sheer size of it and the versatility of that platform makes it incredibly difficult to really regulate it. And one of the other issues is that you have people in Congress who literally don't know how technology works. Yeah. Like, they don't know how these platforms work. They don't know what the practices are. And then you watch the congressional hearings where they're asking questions to, the Google CEO, Mark Zuckerberg, whoever they're, questioning at that time. And it's just embarrassing because they're not equipped with the knowledge necessary to really understand the weight of the issue. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and I didn't even get into it just because for the sake of time, but the tax avoidance that these companies are doing is just absolutely obscene. How they hide profits, how they use kind of tax havens and things like that to just pay basically no taxes on. Like, I mean, there's so many problems with their sheer size and power that it's almost too much to list, and I just needed to save time essentially. But yeah, I mean, again, we'll see. It's kind of like I didn't expect to see this happening, but it's happening. So let's go along for the ride.